You think legends are just stories? Think again. These 5 terrifying encounters, from cursed reservations to haunted swamps and pitch-black backroads, will make you question everything you thought was safe. A skinwalker stalks a Navajo family. Her faceless child creature crawls under beds. White-robed figures march in unison past an old farm gate, and something ancient hums from a mountain cliff, drawing its victims with sound alone. Each story is real, each one leaves a mark. Don't look out your window, don't follow the singing, and whatever you do, don't listen too closely, because some things don't want to be found, they want you. Story 1. Reservation Memories. Skinwalker Terror on Navajo Land. I was born in the spring of 1989 into a family shaped by centuries of Navajo tradition and quiet resilience. Though we didn't live in the central heart of the Navajo Nation, our home stood on a more isolated portion of reservation land in northern Arizona, a patch of earth my father's side of the family had quietly resettled on decades earlier. They never said much about why they left their original home. Anytime I asked, my father would only say it was a family matter, and that was usually enough to shut down the conversation. As a child, I never thought much of it. The land felt eternal. Wide open fields that stretched until they blurred into hazy green brush, clusters of pinyon and juniper trees that painted the horizon, summers that scorched and buzzed with heat, and winters that were mild enough to let us run outside, in sweaters. There was a winding arroyo, the dry bed of an old creek, that cut across the southern edge of our property. It would flood during monsoon season, a wild gushing ribbon of water, then dry back to cracked earth for the rest of the year. I loved everything about it. That land was all I'd ever known, and I assumed it would always be safe, always be home. My father worked for the tribal council, organizing youth events and cultural programs, and he took pride in it. He was a reserved man, always neat, always thoughtful, who believed in keeping our community grounded in tradition. My mother was warmer, but no less strong. She helped run a small gas station and convenience store on the edge of the reservation, where she knew almost every customer by name. Our lives weren't luxurious, but we were never desperate. We had food, shelter, and each other. There were 3 of us children. My older sister Ava was 13, sharp-tongued, curious, and always testing her boundaries. I was 10, caught in that in-between space where imagination still ruled but the real world was starting to take shape. And then there was Peter, just 5 years old, full of noise and joy, and always clutching one of his plastic dinosaur toys wherever he went. We lived in a modest double-wide trailer enclosed by a chain-link fence that did little more than mark the edge of our world. Beyond the fence stretched what most people referred to as the woods, though in truth it was more of a scattered thicket, patches of trees and brush that darkened quickly in the evenings. And then, beyond the trees, the land dipped into a shallow valley. From the rise just behind our trailer, you could see for miles on a clear day. It was beautiful in a quiet, rugged way, and I never once thought of it as dangerous. That year, 1999, seemed to begin just like any other. We were still going to school, doing chores, playing in the dirt. On weekends, my father would bring us to cultural events where we'd listen to drummers and storytellers, and my mother would burn juniper bundles in quiet prayers. Life was predictable, safe, but underneath it all, there was a hum I hadn't yet learned to listen for. Something that stirred just beyond the edges of our understanding, something waiting, patient, watching, and soon it would make itself known. It was around September of 1999 when the first rumors started. They came quietly, like the early wind before a dust storm. At first, they were just casual mentions in conversation, things overheard at the gas station, where my mother worked, or whispered among neighbors at the market. People spoke of strange footprints showing up in the dust outside their homes, of animal carcasses found near the outskirts of the reservation, torn apart in ways that didn't make sense, not just killed, but mangled, deliberately, viciously. Like something wanted to send a message. At first, no one paid them much mind. Arizona had its share of wild animals. Coyotes were common. Now and then, someone would spot a mountain lion in the distance or find a rattlesnake curled in the sun. And, of course, feral dogs sometimes wandered through, lean and ragged from hunger. But the things people were describing didn't fit the usual explanations. These weren't clean kills from a predator looking for food. These were violent, disfiguring, wrong. Some said it might be kids pulling a sick prank. Others figured it was just overactive imaginations fueled by too many old stories. But I noticed the tone shift whenever the elders were around. They would go quiet, eyes darting, lips pressed into thin lines. One of my neighbors, a quiet man who raised goats, stopped letting his animals graze after dusk. Another woman, who usually let her kids play outside until the stars came out, started calling them in before the sun even touched the hills. Even my father, a man who rarely let fear show, began locking the gate at night. It might not sound like much, but until then he'd never bothered. Our fence wasn't exactly built for security. It was more a symbolic line than anything else. But suddenly it mattered. He'd go out just after sunset, make sure the latch was fastened, then come back inside without a word. When I asked him why, he only said, "It's best to be careful right now. Nothing you need to worry about." Except I did worry. Because when grown-ups start changing their behavior, without explanation, it's like the air itself thickens. My mother began performing her smudging rituals every night. She lit bundles of dried juniper and walked through each room, muttering softly in Navajo as the smoke drifted through the air. She placed small pouches near the door frames, filled with corn pollen and something I didn't recognize. Ava and I asked her about it, but she just smiled tightly and told us it was just a little extra protection. She didn't explain what we needed protection from. One night, maybe a week after the talk of mutilated animals began, I heard a noise outside my bedroom window. It was late, well after midnight, and the house was quiet except for the hum of the fridge and the distant whir of the ceiling fan in the hallway. The sound was faint but distinct, a scratching, like something dragging its nails across the aluminum siding of our trailer. Not fast, slow, testing. It sent a jolt of cold through my spine. I froze in bed, holding my breath. The scratching paused, then resumed, slower this time, like it was exploring, like it was listening for movement inside. I wanted to call for my sister, but my throat locked up. My body wouldn't move. The sound stopped after maybe a minute, though it felt like an hour. Eventually I convinced myself it was a stray cat, or maybe a low-hanging branch brushing against the house in the wind, but I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I watched from the kitchen window as my father did something I'd never seen him do. He walked the perimeter of the yard with a flashlight, despite the fact that the sun was already up. He scanned the fence line, inspected the dirt near the gate, checked the corners of the trailer. When I asked him what he was looking for, he didn't answer right away, just stared at the ground for a moment, then said, "You stay inside after dark, understand?" I nodded, but the knot in my stomach grew tighter. By early October, the stories had spread. 2 teenage boys from a family down the road claimed they'd seen something following them on their walk home from the bus stop. They described it as tall, with arms that hung too low and legs that bent the wrong way. They said it moved on all fours, then suddenly stood upright like a man. No one believed them, at least not openly. Their parents scolded them for making up wild tales. But Ava was friends with one of the boys' sisters, and she told me in whispers that they swore it had eyes that glowed orange. Not reflected, glowed. That detail stuck in my mind. From then on, our nights changed. My mother's rituals became more intense, more deliberate. She made us learn a handful of traditional prayers and insisted we recite them each night before bed. Ava rolled her eyes at first, but obeyed. I followed her lead. Even Peter, who thought it was a game, would whisper the words with wide, curious eyes. My father grew quieter. He started bringing home old texts and printouts from work, papers I wasn't supposed to read but sometimes caught a glimpse of. They mentioned things, old stories, warnings. We still went to school, still had dinner together, still watched television in the evenings. But there was something fragile now, like our lives were made of paper, and something sharp had started to press against the edges, and deep down I began to understand what I didn't have the words to explain. Something was out there, and it knew where we lived. It happened on a night that, by all appearances, should have been ordinary. The air had turned crisp, carrying that dry chill that settled over the Arizona desert each autumn. The sky was perfectly clear, an inky canvas scattered with stars, so vivid they looked close enough to pluck from the heavens. It was late, well past everyone's bedtime, and the trailer was cloaked in silence. The soft ticking of the wall clock in the hallway was the only thing keeping me tethered to the real world as I tiptoed into the kitchen for a glass of water. I wasn't supposed to be up. I'd snuck out of my room, careful not to creak the loose floorboards near Ava's door. I remember the way the linoleum floor felt cool under my feet. As I passed through the hallway toward the kitchen, I paused at the front window, the one with the curtain drawn just enough to leave a narrow gap. And something outside was standing at our gate. At first, I thought it was a person, a man, maybe, tall and still, half swallowed by the shadows beyond the porch light. He was facing the trailer, just standing there, but almost immediately I knew something wasn't right. The figure's posture was wrong, its spine slightly hunched, shoulders sloping too far forward, neck extended like it was straining toward the house. Its arms hung low and loose, not resting at its sides, but draped there, as if they didn't quite know how to hang properly. I ducked instinctively, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. I crouched beneath the window, but couldn't stop myself from peeking again through the gap in the curtain. My breath hitched. It had moved, not away but closer. Now, it was just inside the edge of the porch light, its shoulder caught in the beam. That's when I saw it. The skin, or maybe it was fur, was patchy, uneven, like something halfway through shedding. The color was a dull, dirty blend of gray and brown. There were no clothes, no boots, no jacket, nothing to suggest it was a human being. It didn't stand quite like one either. Its body looked misaligned, like a puppet with tangled strings, joints moving just a little too freely, just a little off. Then it tilted its head slowly, deliberately, scanning the front windows, including mine. I froze. I didn't breathe. I didn't even blink. I knew, deep in the marrow of my bones, that if it saw me, really saw me, something irreversible would happen. It raised its head slightly, nostrils flaring as though it were scenting the air. That subtle animal motion chilled me more than any growl could have. It was sniffing for us. It didn't speak. It didn't growl or hiss. It simply lingered. A presence that didn't belong in this world, much less at the edge of a child's front yard. Then, without warning, it turned, jerky at first, like it had to remember how legs were supposed to work, and disappeared into the brush, just beyond. The fence. I remained crouched beneath the window for what felt like an hour. Eventually I crawled back to my room, heart still thudding, water forgotten. I didn't tell anyone that night. Not yet. I lay in bed wide awake, staring at the ceiling and trying to convince myself I had imagined it. A trick of the light. A sleep-addled hallucination, but I knew what I'd seen, and I wasn't the only one. The next morning I pulled Ava aside and told her everything. The shape at the gate, the way it moved, the smell of its skin, even though the window had been closed. She stared at me in stunned silence, her eyes widening. Then she said something that made my blood run cold. "I think I saw it too," she whispered. "Not like you, not that close. But the other night I thought someone was standing at the edge of the arroyo, watching the trailer. We decided to tell our mother, not our father. He had become too tightly wound, too closed off in the past weeks. But our mother, she would listen, and she did. When I finished describing the figure, she didn't interrupt or scoff. Instead, she nodded slowly, one hand settling gently on my shoulder. Her voice was soft but firm when she spoke. It's important not to give too much power to these things, not with fear, not even with words. Then she did something unexpected. She reached into the old cedar chest at the foot of her bed and pulled out 2 small leather pouches. Each was filled with dried herbs and something that smelled earthy and sharp. She handed one to me, one to Ava. "Wear this always," she said, "especially after dark." That evening, our prayers before bed were longer than usual. My mother added verses we hadn't heard before, and her voice cracked on the last line. My father remained silent throughout, eyes distant as if they were fixed on something beyond the walls of our trailer. I didn't sleep that night, but for the first time, I wasn't the only one lying awake. From that point forward, the sense of dread in our home became a living thing. Not just an emotion, but a presence. We stopped wondering if something was out there. We knew it was. By late October, the whispers had become warnings. What began as isolated murmurs about dead animals and strange silhouettes was now a constant undercurrent in every conversation on the reservation. People didn't speak openly. They didn't have to. A glance between elders, the tightening of lips, a hand reflexively clutched around a protective charm, all these gestures told us more than words ever could. It was as if the land itself had started to remember something dark, and the people who lived on it were remembering too. The boys who'd claimed to be stalked near the bus stop stuck to their story. One of them, I heard through Ava, had started refusing to walk home alone. Their older siblings took turns picking them up, even if it meant missing work or skipping errands. People laughed about it on the surface, tried to pass it off as teenage drama. But there was a tension beneath the laughter, a nervous energy, the kind that clings to the corners of your thoughts when you try to sleep. Around our house, everything became ritual. My mother's nightly smudging now stretched nearly an hour, and the scent of juniper and sweetgrass hung thick in the air. She began placing corn pollen not only on the windowsills, but in small wooden bowls beneath our beds. She taught us more prayers, older ones, with words that even she stumbled over sometimes. Ava and I repeated them dutifully, whispering them, like they might stitch some invisible shield around our dreams. Peter still thought it was a game, but even he had grown quieter when night fell. My father remained distant but focused. Each evening after returning from work, he'd sit at the kitchen table surrounded by printouts and photocopied documents, old tribal lore, letters from distant relatives, even diagrams of traditional protection rites. He wouldn't talk about it, but I saw the strain in his posture, the fatigue in his eyes. Something about him seemed worn thin, like he was bracing for something none of us could name. And then came the night of the howls. It was in March of 2000, just as the winter was fading and the first signs of spring were beginning to show. My father came home early that evening, his face tight with concern. He checked every window, bolted every lock, and told us to stay together in the living room. No television, no lights except for the fireplace. Just sit, be quiet, and don't open the door for any reason. I didn't ask questions. We sat in silence for nearly an hour, the only sound the crackling of dry logs and the faint rattle of wind against the trailer. Then, from somewhere out in the open fields came the first howl, low, guttural, and drawn out. It didn't sound like any coyote I'd ever heard. It was too long, too deep. It rose and fell like a twisted laugh, reverberating through the land. Another howl joined it. Then another. Peter whimpered, clinging to our mother. She held him close, whispering softly in Navajo, her eyes closed, her hands trembling. Ava sat stiffly beside me, pale as the moonlight that managed to sneak through the cracks in the curtain. My father stood by the front door, his hand resting on the handle of a rifle I hadn't seen him use in years. The howling went on for what felt like an eternity, 4, maybe 5 minutes in reality. But in that moment, time stretched out. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I felt like the sound itself had burrowed into my chest, rooting there like a sickness. Then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The silence that followed was louder than the howls had been. It pressed in on us, thick and electric. My father didn't move from the door. We stayed in that room until morning. When the sun finally crept over the hills, we stepped outside as a family. The world looked unchanged. The grass still swayed. The air was cool. Birds chirped like they hadn't heard the night. But on our front door, etched into the wood like a warning, were claw marks, deep, jagged gouges that splintered the panel and carved through the paint. My father placed his palm over them, his face unreadable. Then he turned and went back inside. That day, my mother burned sweetgrass and white sage for hours. She didn't say much, but the way her voice broke during the prayer told me everything I needed to know. We weren't dealing with something random. This wasn't an animal. It wasn't some drifter playing a cruel joke. It was something old, something intentional, and it wanted us to know. After the howling night, something shifted inside our family and across the reservation. It wasn't a dramatic change. No one stood up and declared war on the darkness. But a quiet resolve began to take root, like dry grass bracing for wind. The fear didn't go away, but it hardened into something else. Something older, something protective. Some families chose to leave. They packed up in the middle of the day and drove off without looking back, heading for towns where the air didn't hum with menace. Others, like us, stayed, either because they had nowhere else to go or because they believed fleeing would only give this thing more power. My parents were firmly in that second group. My father said it was his duty to protect not just his family, but his community. My mother believed that abandoning the land, our land, would be an invitation for darkness to spread further. But no one was sleeping well. Even Ava, who had always tried to act tough, grew pale and quiet. She began waking up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, eyes wide and unfocused. She spoke of dreams, if they were dreams at all, of something standing over her bed, whispering in a language she couldn't understand. She said its eyes were red, not orange like the ones the boys described, but deeper, like burning coals. My mother tried everything she could to help. Herbal teas, more smudging, longer prayers. She placed stronger charms in Ava's room and even slept beside her some nights. But the nightmares didn't stop. If anything, they grew worse. It was then that my parents decided to reach out to someone we hadn't seen in years, an elder woman from my mother's side of the family, someone who had been known in her youth as a spiritual practitioner. In Navajo culture, there are ceremonies meant to restore balance when the world has gone off kilter. The protection way, the enemy way, the night way. These are not casual rituals. They require time, space, and someone with true knowledge, not just of the prayers, but of the forces being invited or warded off. She arrived in the spring of 2001. I still remember the way she carried herself. Tall, straight-backed, her face weathered but calm. She didn't smile much, but when she did, it was genuine. She didn't ask questions or demand explanations. She simply unpacked her small bag, laid out herbs, stones, sacred items, and prepared. The night she performed the ceremony, our trailer felt like it was breathing, like the walls inhaled her songs and exhaled the fear that had been festering inside them for so long. She began before sunset and continued deep into the night. She chanted in a low melodic voice, a sound that made the hairs on my neck rise, not from fear but reverence. She burned sacred herbs in a clay bowl, waved eagle feathers in slow circles, and drew symbols in ash on the floor. She poured water around the perimeter of the house and planted ceremonial stakes outside each window and door. There was something in her movements that felt eternal, like this ritual had been done 1,000 times before and would be done 1,000 more. At one point I closed my eyes, and for the first time in months, I felt warmth. Not physical warmth, but something deeper. A sense that just for a little while we were being seen by something good, something older than the thing that stalked us. I didn't sleep that night, but I wasn't afraid. Neither was Ava. She sat beside me, holding my hand tightly, eyes wide but calm, and for a time it worked. The scratching stopped. The footprints around our trailer disappeared. The howls faded into memory. We slept, really slept, for the first time in over a year. We laughed again, ate dinner without jumping at every creak. My mother started humming while she cooked. Peter played outside during the day, chasing lizards like he used to. For a few months, it felt like we had reclaimed something that had been taken. But peace, like all things, is fragile. In early 2002, the disturbances returned, subtle at first. Whispers among neighbors about chickens killed in impossible ways, tools rearranged overnight, a persistent stench near the arroyo. Then came the report of a figure seen atop the community center at dusk. A high school girl claimed it was watching the parking lot, motionless like a scarecrow brought to life. She said it had a long, animal-like face and eyes that didn't blink. She screamed when she saw it. By the time others looked, it had vanished. Still, no one could or would name what we were facing aloud. The elders warned us not to. Don't. Speak of it. Don't dwell on it. Doing so would only give it form, give it strength. They told us to follow the old ways, light fires, say the prayers, avoid the deep woods after nightfall, stay near your homes. But we were tired, all of us. Years of fear had carved grooves into our bones. In the summer of 2002, we hosted a family gathering. Relatives from New Mexico and Utah visited, bringing with them food, stories, laughter. For a moment, it was like the years of darkness had never happened. One afternoon, my cousin Alex suggested we explore near the arroyo. It was daylight. We thought we'd be safe. We weren't. We took Peter along, walking the dry creek bed, searching for interesting rocks and fossils. We laughed, chased dragonflies. Then Alex stopped. His face turned to stone. I followed his gaze and saw it. Standing on a rise no more than 50 yards away was a figure, tall, gaunt, wrapped in what looked like tattered animal skins. Its face was hidden in shadow, but I could feel its eyes on us, cold and empty. It didn't move, not at first. Then slowly it raised one long arm and pointed or beckoned. We ran. I grabbed Peter's hand and sprinted, heart slamming in my chest. We didn't stop until we were back at the trailer. My mother saw our faces and knew instantly. She burned sage, made us drink bitter tea, and recited protection prayers until our hearts slowed. That night I asked her why it had come back. She didn't answer right away. Then she said, "Some spirits don't leave when asked. They leave when they're forced." And I realized maybe we had survived, but we had never really won. By the end of 2004, the fear that had once clung to our community like smoke began to loosen its grip. The sightings slowed. The sounds at night grew rarer. Some said it was the result of the ceremonies, that our collective prayers had formed a spiritual barrier. Others believed the entity had simply moved on, lost interest, or maybe been weakened somehow. A few whispered that the men who had fired their rifles into the darkness that spring had managed to injure it, even if no blood had ever been found. But no one really knew. The truth, if there was one, never came. For us, life resumed in cautious steps. Ava left for college in 2004, determined to put distance between herself and the memories that still haunted her. She returned during holidays, quieter than before, but carrying herself with the strength of someone who had learned to survive. Peter grew into a thoughtful, curious teenager, one who sometimes asked about the years he only vaguely remembered, but never pressed too hard. My parents continued their rituals, though less intensely. The chain-link fence around our yard remained, but my father replaced the old wooden door, the one with the claw marks, with a heavy steel one. The scars were gone, but the memory of them was not. And as for me, I never truly forgot what I saw that night by the gate. Even now, when I walk near the arroyo or catch a glimpse of shadow against moonlight, I feel a faint stirring, like something is watching. The elders say that once you've been marked by something supernatural, a part of it lingers. Not in your skin, but in your awareness, in your silence, in the way you never quite stop looking over your shoulder, just in case. Story 2, Night Watcher. I've always had a fear of the dark, not the usual kind that fades with age, but a deep, gnawing unease that never quite left me. As a child, it wasn't the shadows themselves that scared me, but what might be hiding inside them. My imagination filled the empty spaces with things I couldn't name. I grew up in Kentucky, in a modest house where my brother and I shared a bedroom that once had bunk beds. Eventually, we took them apart, setting the twin mattresses on opposite sides of the room, mine by the right wall, his by the left. It gave us each a little space, but it also made the darkness between us feel wider, deeper. My brother was older, braver, or at least better at pretending. I envied that. On nights when sleep came easily, I'd sometimes watch the soft glow of our nightstand lamp casting shadows along the ceiling. But when I couldn't sleep, especially if I'd napped too long during the day, or stayed up too late watching videos on my phone, that's when the unease would creep in. I'd lie still, the silence pressing against my ears, and imagine every creak of the house was a whisper meant only for me. I'd always check that my feet were covered, that nothing dangled over the bed's edge, because no matter how old some part of me still believed that if anything touched the floor, it would be grabbed. My parents chalked it up to overactive imagination, just a kid with too many scary stories in his head. But deep down, I always felt that my fear wasn't misplaced. That maybe, just maybe, the dark wasn't empty at all. It happened on a night like any other, or at least that's what I told myself. My brother had gone to bed early, like he usually did, while I stayed up, wide awake from having slept most of the day. I wasn't supposed to have my phone after a certain hour, but I snuck it anyway, hoping that watching a few videos might lull me to sleep. I remember clearly, I was watching my favorite YouTuber play a horror game called Franbo, the screen's eerie glow flickering off the walls. The lamp between our beds was off, the room cast in a soft darkness just bright enough to see the outline of furniture. My eyes eventually grew heavy, and I must have dozed off without meaning to. When I woke up, everything felt wrong. The lamp was back on, casting a pale light across the room. My brother was still asleep, undisturbed, but I wasn't. Alone. There at the foot of his bed sat something that didn't belong in our world. It was small, child-sized maybe, but unmistakably inhuman. Its limbs were thin, disturbingly so, like sticks wrapped in pale skin. Its head was bald and elongated, and it had no mouth, just two tiny slits for nostrils and large, sunken black, eyes that looked like voids. I didn't move, I couldn't. I stared, locked in place, while it stared back, unmoving, unblinking. Then, in one jerky, unnatural motion, it slid off my brother's bed and scurried toward my side of the room. My breath caught in my throat, heart slamming in my chest. But instead of climbing onto my bed, it dropped to the floor and disappeared underneath it. I froze, every muscle in my body screaming to run, to yell, to do something. But I didn't. I couldn't. Eventually, I reached out and turned off the lamp, as if pretending it hadn't happened would erase it. I pulled the blanket over my head and lay there, stiff and silent, until sleep finally took me. Even then, I knew something had found me. It didn't end with the first sighting. I wish it had. I tried to convince myself it was a dream, just an overactive imagination bleeding into the edge of sleep. But deep down, I knew better. Something had been in our room. Something had crawled under my bed. And a few nights later it came back. I woke up to the same unnatural stillness, the kind that feels heavy, as if the very air is waiting. The lamp was on again, casting that same pale, almost sickly light across the room. But this time I couldn't move. Not an inch. My arms were pinned to my sides, my legs frozen, my chest tight, like something was pressing down on it. Panic surged through me, but it had nowhere to go. I tried to scream, to call for my brother, but no sound came. My lips wouldn't part. My tongue felt like stone. Then I saw it, sitting on the edge of my bed. It hadn't changed. White, emaciated, faceless, except for those black, hollow eyes that drank in the light and gave nothing back. It stared down at me, head tilted slightly as if studying. I couldn't look away. Even blinking felt impossible. It didn't move, didn't speak. But somehow, I could hear it. In my head, a low, garbled whisper that didn't use words, just intent, malice, hunger. It was like it was trying to reach into my thoughts, rooting around for something it wanted to take. I thought I was going to die. Not from pain, not even from fear, but from the pure, suffocating helplessness of being trapped inside my own body with a thing I couldn't fight or understand. It felt endless. Time had no meaning. Then, just as suddenly, it was gone. I blinked and the light was off. My limbs unlocked. My voice returned in a gasp. I sat up, drenched in sweat, lungs heaving like I'd just surfaced from deep water. There was no trace of it, but the feeling, that crushing weight, that presence, it lingered. And I knew then I hadn't imagined a thing. It had found its way in, and it wasn't done with me yet. After that night, nothing felt the same. I stopped sleeping with the lamp off. I'd keep the TV on low, just for the noise, to fill the silence that once felt harmless, but now throbbed with dread. I checked under my bed every night, even though I knew it wouldn't help. I'd leave the door cracked, but even that made me anxious. What if it came from the hallway next time? I tried to tell my parents. They brushed it off as a vivid nightmare. I told my brother. He laughed at first, but then avoided the topic altogether. No one believed me, or maybe they just didn't want to. I began to wet the bed again, something I hadn't done since I was a toddler. I hated myself for it. The embarrassment was overwhelming, but I couldn't stop. It was like my body knew something I couldn't say out loud. I wasn't safe, not even in sleep. And then, one night, it came again, closer than ever. This time it whispered something, a warning maybe, or a threat. I couldn't remember the words, only the feeling. After that, it never came back. But it didn't need to. It had already left something behind. Story 3. The Sound from the Cliff. It was supposed to be a fun night, something different, something spontaneous. The aurora borealis had been forecast to appear over parts of Idaho, and my aunt, cousin, and I figured we'd make the most of it. We packed snacks, bundled into hoodies, and left the house around 12:30 a.m. The sky was clear, the air unseasonably warm, but still carried a dry chill that settled in your bones. We weren't worried. We'd done this sort of thing before. Overnight drives, stargazing trips, little family outings into the high desert, just for the thrill of the unknown. As we drove deeper into the countryside, the world around us disappeared into blackness. There were no streetlights, no passing cars, just tumbleweeds, jagged rock formations, and open road. Civilization fell away behind us. The silence outside the car was profound, broken only by the hum of tires on asphalt and the occasional gust of wind buffeting the windows. We passed through areas we'd explored in the past, caves, cliffs, abandoned mining trails, but even those familiar places felt different in the dead of night. I sat in the back seat, gazing out at the empty highway, as my cousin dozed off in the front. My aunt kept the music low, soft enough to fade into the stillness beyond the glass. It felt peaceful at first, serene even. But as the miles slipped by and the last road sign vanished behind us, that peace began to curdle into something else. A feeling I couldn't quite place, like we were driving into a space the world had forgotten. We didn't use maps. We thought we knew the way, and in a sense we did. But there are places that don't care how well you know the roads. We arrived at the lookout spot sometime around 2:30 a.m., a gravel turnout on the side of a quiet road, perched just above a steep drop that overlooked a broad, empty valley. It wasn't marked on any map, but my aunt had been here before and said it offered a good view of the sky. My cousin stayed asleep in the front passenger seat, snuggled into her hoodie. My aunt and I stepped out quietly, careful not to slam. The doors or waker. The night air was sharp and dry, and the sky stretched endlessly above us, scattered with stars that blinked cold and bright. We stood in silence, heads tilted back, waiting for the aurora to appear. There was no light pollution out here, no buildings, no power lines, just the natural stillness of the land, vast and untouched. And then we heard it. It was faint at first, almost easy to dismiss. A low humming sound, not mechanical, not natural, but human, or close to it. A melody without rhythm, like someone trying to hum a tune they'd never heard before. It didn't come from behind us or from the valley, below. It came from the direction of the cliffside, where there was nothing but open air and a sharp drop. I turned to my aunt, assuming it was her, but her eyes were already on me. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I nodded. "Wasn't that you?" She shook her head, suddenly pale. "I thought it was you." The humming got louder. It wasn't just a sound. It felt like it was brushing against our skin, weaving through the air inside our bones. It was wrong, familiar in the way a stranger calling your name can sound familiar, just enough to freeze you in place. I stepped back toward the car. My aunt didn't hesitate. She opened her door, started the engine, and told me to get in. The sound followed us, but we never saw what made it. I hadn't even shut the car door before my aunt hit the gas. Gravel crunched and spat behind us as the tires struggled for grip, the headlights cutting jagged shadows into the darkness ahead. My leg was still halfway out the door, my heart slamming against my ribs as the humming grew louder, so loud it seemed to reverberate from inside the car, not just around it. My cousin stirred, half awake, blinking in confusion as I yanked my leg in and slammed the door shut. "What's going on?" she mumbled. Neither of us answered. The road curved tightly around the hillside, and my aunt drove like we were being chased, because we were. Not by something we could see, but by something we could feel. The humming wasn't fading with distance. If anything, it seemed to match our speed, as though it had hooked itself onto us. It shifted in tone, warbling like a distorted voice. Male and female at once, stretched and layered. It wasn't music, it wasn't language, it was something pretending to be both. I turned and looked out the rear window, expecting to see headlights. A figure, anything, but there was only blackness. Still the sound remained. Low, clinging, hunting. We drove for miles, not speaking, not blinking, until finally, it stopped. Not with a fade, not with distance, but like someone had flipped a switch. Silence returned in a rush, pressing against our eardrums so suddenly it made my head throb. We didn't stop until we saw the lights of a gas station miles down the highway. Inside, under the hum of fluorescent bulbs and the clink of glass refrigerator doors, my aunt finally exhaled. She wouldn't say what she thought it was, not then. But later, when we told the story, she said she believed it had followed us from the cliffs, something ancient, something drawn by sound and silence alike. I haven't gone stargazing since, and sometimes when the wind slips through the trees just right, I swear I still hear it. Story 4. Stillness in the Pasture. The farm wasn't isolated, not in the way haunted places are usually described. It sat on the rural outskirts of a mid-sized town in northwestern Colombia, just far enough from the main road to feel quiet, but close enough to never be truly alone. My family owned it for years, and on the surface it was a lovely place. The land stretched far in all directions, divided between open pastures and small patches of native forest that rippled like green waves in the wind. The buildings themselves were modest: an old farmhouse, a small set of stables, a tool shed warped from rain and age, but they were functional, weathered by time, but never forgotten. As kids, my sister and I loved it. We'd run through the grass, climb the old fence posts, play tag near the stable. Whenever friends came with us, they joined in without hesitation. It was freedom, wide, open and green. But when night fell, the mood shifted. It wasn't just that it got dark. It was how it got dark. Even when the moon was full, the fields outside the house felt like they were wrapped in velvet. Pitch black, soundless. The kind of dark that swallowed shapes, muffled footsteps, and made familiar paths disappear. We always told ourselves we'd try camping out in the fields just for fun, but we never followed through. Every time as dusk rolled in and the light faded from the horizon, some primal part of us decided against it. Looking back now, I think we knew, without fully knowing, that something wasn't quite right. The farm was beautiful, yes, but the dark there felt different, not just empty, but watchful, as if the land itself was waiting for something or someone. The first strange event didn't happen to me. It happened to a friend named Ben, who had come to stay at the farm for a few days during a school break. It was sometime past midnight when he decided to step outside, unable to sleep. The stables were always kept lit at night, just a precaution. Really? So he wandered toward them, figuring he'd check on the horses and maybe get some fresh air. What he saw chilled him to the bone. One of the horses was standing completely still, but its tail was moving, being braided, slowly, delicately. But there was no one there. No shadow, no sound, just the tail folding in on itself, as if guided by invisible hands. He stood frozen for several seconds, watching the braid tighten with mechanical precision. Then, without warning, it stopped. The tail dropped, loose and lifeless again. Ben backed away slowly, then turned and walked quickly back to the house. He didn't run. He told me that part specifically. He didn't want to seem like prey. The next morning, when he told us what he'd seen, my sister and I laughed at first. But something in his face, the way his voice faltered when he described it, we didn't forget it, not even for a second. It hung in the air for the rest of the day, an unspoken tension none of us could shake. A few nights later, it was my turn. I woke up around 3 a.m. stirred by a sound I couldn't place. Heavy footsteps, right outside my bedroom window. I didn't open my eyes at first, hoping it would pass, but it didn't. The footsteps circled the house, slow and deliberate, the kind of pace someone uses when they know exactly where they are. When they're familiar, when they're hunting, and then it stopped right outside the glass. I heard a deep, steady breathing. Not animal, not quite human either. Just wrong. I couldn't open my eyes. Whether it was fear or instinct, I kept still. Completely still. Minutes passed. Then the footsteps resumed, moving away, fading into the trees. I didn't sleep the rest of the trip. It was sometime later, months, maybe a year, when the white figures appeared. My sister had been outside one afternoon playing with two of her friends near the front gate. The gate was tall, made of iron bars and solid enough to block most of the view from the road beyond. You could only see the feet of anyone passing by unless they came up close. But that day, she noticed something different. 4 sets of feet moving in perfect unison. White robes brushing the ground with each synchronized step. At first, she thought it might be some sort of religious group. We weren't strangers to the occasional visitor or traveling missionary passing through, but there was something off. The figures stopped right in front of the gate, lined up shoulder to shoulder, their robes hanging down like curtains. Then they turned, slowly at the exact same moment, and faced the gate. Not one at a time. All 4 at once, as if responding to some unheard command. Then they turned back around, still in unison, and walked away with the same synchronized pace, never breaking formation, never looking side to side. My sister didn't scream, she didn't call for anyone. She just stood there, frozen, until the last white hem disappeared behind the rise of the road. She told us later that their steps were too perfect, like a machine, not like people. She hadn't seen their faces, and for that she was thankful. Whatever they were, they hadn't come to speak or interact. They'd just come to be seen. After that, things changed. We still saw regular folks pass by on occasion, workers, neighbors, the mail carrier, but every now and then someone would mention seeing people in white walking down the road late at night, always in 4s, always moving in step. No one ever saw where they came from or where they went, and none of us ever saw their faces. Looking back now, none of us can say for certain what we were dealing with. There was no single moment where it all came to a head. No final confrontation, no satisfying explanation. Just a slow accumulation of strange events that refused to align into any one story. After the figures at the gate, smaller oddities continued to crop up. One morning we found a young armadillo in the field, torn open, in a way that didn't make sense. No scavenger could have done that. A visiting farmhand once swore he saw a monkey-like creature, pure white and running upright on 2 legs, dash across the field at dawn. He'd never seen anything like it before. And we had no monkeys in the area, wild or otherwise. The strangest part of it all wasn't the events themselves, but the feeling, the way the farm changed after dark. We'd grown up there, knew every tree and dip in the land, but something about the night air made it feel like we were trespassers in our own home, as if something older was watching. Not evil exactly, just possessive. We never found tracks we could explain. We never caught anyone trespassing. No one admitted to any elaborate pranks. But those moments stayed with us. They surface in dreams. They come back when the wind moves a certain way through the trees. And sometimes when I return to that place, even now as an adult, I feel it again. That weight pressing against the dark. That certainty that we were not alone. We still don't know what haunted that farm. We only know it never fully left. Story 5. The Witch of the Maine Woods. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend, Just 3 college friends trying to escape the stress of classes and campus noise. I was a junior at the University of Maine at the time, and along with my 2 closest friends, Charlotte and Isaac, we'd rented a cabin in a tiny town called Glover's Creek. The place was barely a dot on the map, nestled between thick forests and winding back roads. We'd heard vague rumors about the area, something about a colonial-era witch who had vanished into the woods centuries ago, but we didn't think much of it. It was just the kind of local lore you expect in places like this, the kind that adds atmosphere without substance. The cabin itself was old, creaky floors, drafty windows, and that faint, musty scent of disuse, but it had everything we needed. 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, and just enough space to stretch out and feel like we'd gone somewhere real. After unloading our bags, we headed into the town proper. There wasn't much to see. A tiny diner, a general store, and a library that looked like it hadn't changed since the 1950s. It was the librarian who brought up the legend. She was an older woman with sharp eyes and a calm voice. When Charlotte asked half-jokingly if the town had any good ghost stories, the woman paused. Then she mentioned the swamp, said some folks believed a spirit still roamed the water's edge at night. A woman in white, a voice that called out. When the moon was high, Charlotte was delighted. Isaac raised an eyebrow. I just smiled and said, "Guess we're going to the swamp." None of us realized that by chasing a story, we'd find something real. The next afternoon, armed with flashlights, a cheap camp lantern, and more enthusiasm than sense, we made our way toward the swamp. It wasn't hard to find, just a half-mile down a rutted dirt road, the trees thickening around us like a closing fist. The air grew damper with every step, heavy with the smell of mud and decaying leaves. By the time we reached the clearing, the ground squished underfoot, and the sun was little more than a smudge of gold behind the trees. The swamp stretched out before us, black water broken by clumps of reeds and fallen branches. The surface was so still it looked solid. It was quiet, too quiet. No frogs, no insects, no rustle of birds in the brush. Just our own breathing and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. We set up near the water's edge, lighting the lantern and placing it between us. At first we talked and joked, trying to keep the mood light. Charlotte tossed pebbles into the swamp, watching the ripples spread. Isaac kept glancing over his shoulder, as if half expecting something to lurch out of the darkness. I tried not to let my nerves show, but I felt it too, that electric sense that we were not supposed to be here. It was close to midnight when we heard the splash. All 3 of us froze. The lantern's light wavered in the breeze as we strained to see across the water. At first there was nothing, just ripples licking the reeds. Then something began to form. A faint glow, like mist, coalescing into the rough shape of a figure. It stood above the water, not in it, not on land, floating. There were no distinct features, just the silhouette of a woman, her head tilted slightly as if listening. She swayed back and forth gently, almost in rhythm with the ripples. Charlotte clutched my arm. Isaac didn't move at all. I couldn't look away. The figure drifted closer, the faint moaning sound beginning to rise again, soft, mournful, and deeply wrong. It wasn't just a noise. It felt like something trying to speak but failing, trapped between worlds. We didn't wait to see what happened next. We didn't speak as we ran, just the sound of boots pounding damp earth, breath coming in short gasps, the snap of twigs underfoot. The glowing figure hadn't followed, but we didn't stop to check. We didn't even gather our things. We left the lantern burning on the bank like a fragile beacon in a place that didn't want us. When we reached the car, we slammed the doors, locked them without thinking. Isaac drove, gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. Charlotte sat in the back seat, arms folded across her chest, still staring out the window as though expecting to see that glowing shape drift between the trees. I stared straight, ahead, heart still hammering, trying to make sense of what we'd just seen. Back at the cabin, no one said a word. We turned on every light, slept in our clothes, kept the curtains shut. Every creak in the wood, every gust of wind against the glass made us flinch. Charlotte wanted to talk it out, process it, make it real. Isaac refused, said the more we talked about it, the more power we gave it. I didn't know who to agree with. All I knew was that I hadn't imagined it. None of us had. By morning, we were packed and ready to leave. We didn't even eat breakfast. We left a polite, vague note for the cabin owner and hit the road as soon as the sky turned grey with daylight. None of us have returned to Glover's Creek. Over time, we told the story to others, but it never came out quite right. People always smiled politely, nodding along, never truly understanding. It's hard to explain how something without a face can still stare at you, how something that didn't speak can still leave you with words you'll never unhear. Maybe it was a ghost. Maybe it was just something old and tired that didn't want to be disturbed. But sometimes when I wake in the middle of the night, I remember the way it swayed. And I wonder if it's still there, standing silently in the dark, waiting for someone else to listen. Thank you for venturing into the darkness with us. If these stories sent chills down your spine, don't keep the fear to yourself. Leave a comment, smash that like button, and share this video with someone who dares to listen in the dark. We release terrifying true stories every week, so be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what's lurking in the shadows. This is High Scare Stories, where nightmares don't end when the video does. Until next time, stay safe and stay scared.